Hello, everyone. Welcome, and particularly a warm welcome to the board of the Legal Services Corp. Welcome to the state of Maine. We're very happy that you're here, and in a small way, I'm living proof that you're here in Maine, because when you think about it, where else but Maine would your speaker be the guy from the local lumberyard? I mean, seriously. Like, I'm really lucky to be living where I'm living, but the work I do and the work you do could look very different, but the theme or the thought I wanted to share today was on how it's similar. And the way in which I think it's similar is that everyone in this room has a shared belief, I'm willing to bet, that every voice should matter. Not most voices, not on most days, but every voice, everywhere, every day should matter. And I really think that while the work you do is legal in essence, it's really the work of humanity that you're doing. I believe that the single most important idea in the history of humans, is kind of a big one. I believe the single most important idea in the history of humans is equal before the law. I've thought about this a lot, and I've not yet come to a human idea that I think is more important than that one. Equal before the law on an individual level, every individual equal before the law. And that objective only has one alternative, and it's just clearly not desirable, which is unequal before the law. And when a community or a society or a planet becomes unequal before the law, everything tips the wrong way. And certain groups become favored, the law becomes arbitrary, and corruption prevails. And I think this story plays out time and time again across human history, whether it was East Germany and West Germany. To me, equal before the law was the only difference between the fate of those two countries. North Korea and South Korea, equal before the law. Those four words, in my view, are the difference between those two countries. And I'm a big optimist on this subject. I am certain that the long arc of humanity is bending towards everyone has a voice. That's where humanity is headed. But it is a long arc that requires work for the long haul. Furthermore, I believe that the human quest could be described simply as the quest to self-actualize. For every individual to come into his or her never to be repeated again unique voice. To find it, to know it, to own it, and to bring it forth and share it with the world. And I'd like to tell you a quick story about how a lumber company executive from Maine came to these personal conclusions. And I'll start at the end and then back up. So it was the day before Halloween, October 2012, and I found myself, a guy from a small town here in Maine, standing alone at the Wounded Knee Massacre site on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the southwest corner of South Dakota. And a short while later, this really well-worn car pulled up. At Pine Ridge, they call it a res car because you can't get a permit to drive it in the state of South Dakota. And this lovely jewelry maker, old jewelry maker, rolled down her window, rolled it down, and with a grand smile said, "What brings you here?" And I reciprocated her smile and said, "That's a great question." It was such a great question that it would take me 4 more trips to that remote reservation before I felt I began to know the answer. All I knew at the time was that I was searching, which is something I've since come to believe is universally human. I was searching for my voice, ironically, in a community where no one felt heard. I have a friend, Jose Miguel Sokoloff, who's Colombian, who has a saying I love, which is this: we all adhere to a belief system. Otherwise, we don't have a strategy for dealing with a complex world. 4 dates contribute to my belief system: 1848, 2007, 2010, and 2012. 1848, that's the year our company began doing business here in Maine. And I'm part of the 6th generation of my family to work for our company. And we have 550 people today who are a part of our team across Maine. We grow trees, we manufacture lumber, and we distribute lumber and building materials globally and locally. In 2007, as you know, the national housing and mortgage markets began to collapse. In the 3 years that followed, our sales fell by 50%, essentially without losing a customer. That's just how much smaller the construction market got in a hurry. In 2010, at the peak of that collapse, unconnected to me then, but totally connected to me in hindsight, I began to have trouble speaking. So when I would go to talk, all the muscles in my throat would spasm and squeeze and contract, and my voice got very, very broken and hoarse and hard, even often for someone sitting right beside me to hear. So I went to a doctor, and then another doctor, and another doctor, and about a year later, I ended up at the Mass Eye and Ear Clinic in Boston, where my now friend, Dr. Song, told me I had spasmodic dysphonia, which is a rare neurological disorder that affects only speech with no known cause and no known cure. At the time of onset, however, I didn't know what I had. I had no strategy for dealing with it, and I could barely talk. And I laugh about this now, but I said to myself at the time, what possible good could a CEO be who can't talk all the time? And how am I going to go about doing my job? And initially, my strategy was just to protect my voice. So when it's hard to talk, you find ways to talk less. And the simple way I found to talk less was to ask more questions, and particularly to answer a question with a question. So picture this age-old scene at work. Someone comes to me with a question because I'm the the boss or one of the leaders of the company, and I would listen to the question, but knew I wasn't going to be able to give an answer. So I started saying, "That's a great question. What do you think we should do about it?" And originally, I started saying this just to put the conversation back on the other person. Then that person would tell me what he or she thought we should do about it. And if it was at all reasonable, which it essentially always was, I said, "That sounds great, let's do that." I'm not kidding you. This was like my management approach. And off he or she would go with his or her solution to his or her problem. And over time, you know what struck me. People already knew what to do. They already had great answers to the difficult problems that they saw. And so it really fascinated me. If they already knew what to do, why weren't they doing it? And how gentle or simple a push it took for people to trust their own judgment and run with it. So on to Pine Ridge, and then I'll come back and wrap this up. So by 2012, the economy had settled, and I could see that our company, my tribe, community was going to be fine, and I had this growing sensation at the time that I tried to fight, but I couldn't, which was I needed to serve myself a little bit more, to catch my breath, or to find my voice. And I didn't know how I was going to go about doing that, but that summer in August, I was at the Portland Jetport, and I picked up a copy of National Geographic, and the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation was on the cover. There was a young Lakota boy riding a Mustang bareback across a rolling hill, and the title read, "In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, the Rebirth of a Sioux Nation." And I read that article, and it was as if every character ever connected to that story jumped out of that yellow magazine and gave me a hug. And when I finished, I leaned over and I patted my wife on the leg, and I said, "I'm going to go there." That was my entire plan. I'm going to go there. I want to see what life is like for the people who have been there. I've since been there 20 times. Have tons of friends there. Was really embarrassed about how to answer initially what I did there, because I didn't do anything there. I just hung out with the people who live there. I didn't go there to fix, save, change, or correct anyone. I was just really, really interested in the people who lived there, and I felt they had lots to offer the world that wasn't being seen or heard, if you will, and taken advantage of. And I've since come to believe that awareness and connectivity in and of itself is a really powerful act. But the combination of my own voice condition and then traveling to Pine Ridge really helped me see two things, which is, I think, the connector back to the work you do. There are lots of ways to lose your voice in this world. And the second thought, which really made me kind of freeze in my tracks, is that probably throughout history, leaders had done more to restrict and inhibit and limit the voices of others than to release them. The Sioux have 7 sacred rites, and one of them you definitely would have heard of. It's the Vision Quest rite. And the vision quest, in my view over time, listening and learning, was really about helping individuals come into their own voice. You had to leave your tribe, journey alone into the wilderness, and pray or cry for a vision. The Lakota term is hamble chi'a, which means to cry for a vision. And if you were fortunate enough to receive some insight into the essence of who you were expected to come back and stand in circle and share what you learned about your own voice and your own truth and live your life in accordance with that message and mission. And that's when it occurred to me at one point out west that I was having a bit of my own modern day vision quest experience. And the vision was simply this: the partial loss of my own voice, which they told me was incurable, and I've largely cured, not completely, but largely, and I love that fact. But the partial loss of my own voice, which I'd only previously thought of as a hindrance or a disability or a pain in the neck, was actually a blessing. And it was a gift, and it was a calling, and it was an opportunity, because I was in a position of leadership, and the opportunity was to do what I could to help strengthen the voices of others, especially those who did not always feel heard, whether they were on a remote reservation on the Northern Plains, or in a sawmill, or a lumber yard in Western Maine. So back at work, just to wrap up, the idea became super simple. What if we could create a culture where everybody led, where every voice felt trusted, respected, valued, and heard? Wouldn't an organization where everybody led outperform a more traditional model where just a few people held all the decision-making cards? But more importantly, beyond economics, wouldn't it be more socially valuable? Adults need places to self-actualize, to keep coming into their own voice across the journey of a lifetime. And because so many people work, and because everybody at work is super important, work is actually a great platform to pursue that mission. And I could go on and on about this, but you have lots of super cool things to do today. But that's the story, perhaps the unexpected story, of how a lumber company executive and yourself might have actually found themselves on a common mission of strengthening the voices of others, making sure that every individual is heard, and recognizing that if that cannot happen before the law, that it's at risk everywhere. So I really salute you and the work you do, and appreciate the opportunity to be a small part of your time together here in Maine. So I'll close with this. As they say at Pine Ridge, Wopila Tonka, which means big thanks. Thank you for having me.